It was the tail end of summer 2008 when 24-year-old Erin Callahan checked into a roadside motel off Interstate 80 just outside Lincoln, Nebraska. She had her infant son with her, 10-month-old Callum, and not much else. A single overnight bag, a folded stroller, and a weather-worn diaper tote. Surveillance footage from the motel's front office shows her arriving just past 9:07 p.m., driving a rusted silver sedan with Missouri plates. She's wearing an oversized gray hoodie, jeans, and her hair is pulled back in a frayed ponytail. She looks tired, distracted, but calm. Callum is asleep in the back seat. She carries him in one arm, the diaper bag in the other. At check-in, she gives the name Erin Carter, not Callahan, a detail that won't become significant until much later. The desk clerk remembers her being soft-spoken, polite, barely looking up as she signed the guest ledger. She paid in cash for a single night and declined housekeeping. Her room was 112, farthest from the main road around the corner from the ice machine, out of view from most of the property. Nothing about her check-in raised an alarm. The footage shows her pushing the stroller toward the room, unlocking the door, and going inside. The door shuts behind her. That's the last time anyone sees Erin or her son alive. The next morning, around 11:00 a.m., a housekeeper knocked to begin cleaning. No answer. The "Do Not Disturb" tag was still hanging. After waiting 10 minutes, she let herself in. The room was spotless. The bed was neatly made, towels folded, no clothes, no suitcases, no diapers, no baby formula, no baby. Nothing that suggested anyone had stayed the night. But the bed had been slept in. The imprint of a body on one side, the other side untouched. The air conditioning was still running. The housekeeper assumed the guest had left early and simply forgotten to check out. But when the clerk went outside to inspect the parking lot, Erin's car was still there, parked exactly where it had been the night before. The passenger side door was locked, the driver's side too. Keys weren't inside, neither was the car seat. The room key, however, had been returned, left neatly on the dresser. The motel manager called the local sheriff's office around noon. By 1:15 p.m., a deputy arrived to begin a wellness check. He looked through the room, found nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damage to the door. It had been locked from the inside and showed no sign of tampering. He requested access to the motel's surveillance system. The exterior cameras were old, low resolution, grainy. But they confirmed one thing clearly. No footage existed of Erin or her son ever leaving the room. She walked in. She never walked out. Investigators reviewed hours of footage, rewinding, pausing, zooming in on every angle. The hallway camera caught her going into room 112. It never caught her coming out. The rear exit camera, facing the parking lot, showed nothing. No figures leaving, no cars starting, no one carrying anything resembling a baby. Every guest that passed through that hallway or parked near Erin's car was accounted for. It was as if she had simply vanished into the room. Deputies canvassed the motel. Guests in neighboring rooms remembered hearing a baby crying briefly around 10 p.m., but assumed it was nothing unusual. One man, in room 110, said he thought he heard voices, a woman speaking softly and then a thump like something dropping on carpet. But he couldn't place the time exactly. He had been drinking. Another guest swore she heard a baby monitor crackle faintly from the hallway when she passed the room, but again, thought nothing of it. Erin's name was run through missing persons databases. That's when the alias became significant. No one named Erin Carter was listed missing, but cross-checking the vehicle registration with Missouri plates led investigators to a real identity. Erin Callahan, reported missing by her sister 3 days earlier after failing to return home from a road trip she had taken to clear her head. Callum wasn't listed in the report. It hadn't even occurred to the family that he was missing, too. Over the next 48 hours, authorities cordoned off the room, combed the motel, brought in scent-tracking dogs and forensic units. Nothing. No blood. No trace DNA. The bedspread was clean. The sink was dry. The mini fridge is empty, trash cans spotless. Even the drain pipes were cleared, just in case. The baby was too young to walk. Erin was not a known drug user, had no documented mental health issues, and had never abandoned Callum, even temporarily. Her cell phone had been shut off around 9:18 p.m. the night before, just minutes after she entered the room. It pinged a nearby tower once and never again. By day 3, the search widened to nearby woods, gas stations, dumpsters. Erin's car was towed and searched inch by inch. Her wallet was gone. So were her phone and a small blue baby blanket her sister remembered she never traveled without. But the license plates were clean. No prints except hers. The motel had no other open complaints that week, no break-ins, no disturbances, and no one else disappeared. It was as if room 112 swallowed a mother and child whole. Detectives would later describe it as one of the most disturbing disappearances they had ever worked on, not because of blood or violence or obvious trauma, but because of the absence of it. Erin and her son were just gone. With no trace, no sound, no witness, and that blank, silent room would stay that way. For a long time. Because no one knew yet that the real story hadn't even begun. Not really. Not until what was buried beneath that room finally came to light. 17 years later. The initial sweep of the motel turned up nothing. Erin's car sat untouched. The room was clean. No visible blood, no broken locks, no signs of forced entry or a struggle. It was the kind of scene that looked normal at first glance, too normal. That made it worse. Investigators went back to the surveillance footage and started from the top, every camera angle, every timestamp. They watched her walk in, the baby in her arms, the bag slung over her shoulder. The timestamp read 9:07 p.m. But that was it. No footage of her leaving, no stroller, no child, no shape slipping out through the hallway or parking lot, no shadows in the dark, nothing. The rear hallway door had a camera mounted above it, grainy, black and white, but still functional. It showed every guest who came and went that night, the delivery guy who dropped off fast food at room 118, the young couple who argued in the parking lot, the man from room 114 who came outside 3 separate times to smoke. None of them interacted with Erin, none of them noticed anything strange. Not one of them mentioned a baby. Officers checked the door to room 112. It was the kind that locked automatically. The keycard system showed it was opened only once when Erin entered the room. After that, no one else. No re-entry. No record of it ever unlocking again. It was as if the room had simply sealed shut and time had stopped inside it. They checked the windows. No cracks, no pry marks. The window locks were still engaged. Maintenance records showed no known issues with the frames or hinges. Even if she had tried to climb out, the drop led to a rear drainage ditch partially fenced off with dense thorn brush. Officers inspected the brush. No broken branches, no footprints, no disturbed ground. Inside the room, small items were gone. Her phone wasn't there. Neither was her purse, her wallet, or Callum's diaper bag. But oddly, the room didn't feel looted. The TV remote was untouched. The nightstand drawer still held a motel Bible. The pillow had a faint impression where her head had rested, but the other pillow remained fluffed. The crib she had requested wasn't used. The bed was clearly where she and Callum had slept, even if just briefly. If she left voluntarily, why wouldn't anyone have seen her? Why leave the car behind? If she left under duress, how did someone get in and out of a locked room without leaving a trace? The baby wasn't old enough to walk. That was confirmed by my family. He had just begun pulling himself up on furniture, but couldn't move around on his own. He would have needed to be carried, which meant if she left, she carried him. And someone would have noticed that. But nobody did. There was no account of a woman walking with a baby that night, not from any guest, not from nearby businesses, not from the gas station across the highway. Detectives interviewed motel staff again. The night clerk remembered Erin as quiet, maybe tired. Said she barely looked up while checking in. Nothing stood out. No arguments, no disturbances, no complaints. Not from her, not about her. She checked in, went to her room, and vanished. What started to concern investigators more than what was found was what wasn't. No fingerprints other than hers in the room. No DNA under the bed or in the bathroom that couldn't be traced back to cleaning staff. The sheets were clean but not freshly laundered, meaning she'd used the bed, likely for only a few hours. But after that, nothing. There was no note, no evidence of planning, no receipts or itinerary. Her phone record stopped cold after a single ping from the motel tower, time-stamped minutes after check-in. No outgoing texts, no calls. Her voicemail hadn't been accessed since the day before. It became harder for detectives to ignore the theory that maybe Erin had left on her own, that she wanted to disappear. Maybe she was hiding from someone. Maybe she left everything behind, family, obligations, even her name, and started fresh. But that didn't explain the car, or the baby, or the silence. By day 6, the case felt like it had already stalled. Officers returned to the motel repeatedly, hoping for something they'd missed, a misaligned door frame, a scuff mark on a hallway wall, anything. But there were no new leads, no reports of an abandoned child. No sightings, no credit card use, no surveillance hits across state lines. Detectives began using a word they hated: cold. It wasn't official, not yet, but in quiet conversations behind closed doors, they started admitting what no one wanted to say out loud. There was no witness, no exit, no noise, just a locked room, an empty crib, and a silence so complete it felt intentional. And that silence was about to deepen. Because what came next would only add to the confusion, not solve it. When a young mother and her infant vanish without a trace, police often start with the closest person to her. In Erin Callahan's case, that was Mark Greer, her ex-boyfriend, the biological father of her son, Callum. On paper, they were never married. On record, their relationship was defined by breakups, protective orders, and long silences. But to the people who knew Erin best, his name raised alarm long before the police made contact. Mark was 29 years old at the time of the disappearance, working full-time as a mechanic at an auto shop on the south side of Kansas City. He lived alone, no roommates, no kids, and, legally speaking, no custody of Callum. He had petitioned the court twice in 2007 for shared visitation, but had both requests denied after Erin submitted affidavits documenting verbal threats, unwanted visits, and one incident in which Mark reportedly followed her home from work. Police records confirmed at least 2 domestic calls had been placed from Erin's apartment during their relationship. No arrests were made, no charges stuck. But the pattern was there. When investigators reached out to Mark, he didn't seem surprised. His tone was flat. He said he hadn't seen Erin in over 6 weeks, claiming she hadn't responded to his texts or calls since early July. He said he was trying to give her space. When asked about Callum, he told officers he wasn't even sure the kid was his, but later admitted he had seen the baby only once, briefly, in a parking lot during a custody drop-off argument. According to Erin's sister, that visit hadn't gone well. Erin came home shaking. She told her sister that Mark had cornered her in her car and said, "If I can't have you, no one will." That quote ended up in the case file. Mark became the immediate focus of the investigation. Detectives requested a full background check and collected statements from Erin's friends, family, neighbors. Nearly all of them pointed toward him. They described him as controlling, erratic, someone who never fully accepted the breakup. Erin had told at least 2 friends that she was thinking about leaving town to get away from him for good, not just changing addresses, but changing everything. That she was scared to file another report because she didn't think it would lead anywhere. She believed if she disappeared, it would be because of him. The timing couldn't have looked worse. She vanished. Her phone went dark, her baby went with her, and all the evidence of her presence at the motel, the check-in, the room use, the car still parked outside, pointed to a woman who hadn't intended to vanish, not unless someone forced her. But the first crack in that theory came fast. Security footage from Mark's workplace showed him arriving at 3:56 p.m. the night Erin checked into the motel, nearly 5 hours before she disappeared. He was in the repair bay until just after midnight, working on 3 cars with 2 other employees. Shop cameras recorded him continuously. Time cards matched. His cell phone pinged towers consistent with his job site all night. At 12:14 a.m., he clocked out, got into his truck, and went home. His neighbor's motion light picked him up entering his apartment at 12:32 a.m. Cell records showed him logging into a gaming server at 12:51 and staying active until 2:20. Then nothing until morning. The alibi held. Detectives were reluctant to let him go. One officer described the situation later as a suspect-shaped hole in a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Everything around him suggested a motive, but the timeline was airtight. Unless he had an accomplice, and no one came forward to suggest that, he simply couldn't have been at the motel that night. The drive from his job to Lincoln would have taken over 3 hours. There was no window for it, no break long enough, no trip he could have taken without being noticed. Still, they didn't rule him out. His file remained open. His name stayed in the press. When the story broke statewide, his face was the one they used beside Aaron's in the news graphics. Aaron missing, baby missing, father under scrutiny. In the absence of new information, the public did what it always does. It filled in the blanks. Online forums speculated. Social media ran wild. Strangers dug through Mark's digital footprint, pulling up old Facebook posts, comment threads, angry rants from years before. Some made sense, others were baseless. But none of them mattered to the investigation if the footage didn't lie. In the weeks that followed, Mark became defensive. He gave no further interviews, hired an attorney, refused additional polygraphs. One news outlet caught him pacing outside his apartment during a thunderstorm, refusing to answer questions and muttering, "I didn't do anything. Why doesn't anyone believe me?" Privately, Aaron's family never accepted his innocence. Her mother called him the last ghost standing, and Aaron's sister would later say that even if he didn't physically take Aaron and Callum, he still broke her down enough to want to disappear. It was a hard truth, one that the detectives wrestled with too, because the more they dug, the less they found. The motel room remained sealed. The surveillance footage was reanalyzed by digital forensics. No tampering, no skips, no signs of a masked figure, a janitor, a secret passage. Just silence. And that silence, heavy and unbroken, pushed the team back to the motel again. Not to look at suspects this time, but at the building itself. Because something about room 112 still didn't sit right. And soon, someone would come forward with something strange, something small, something almost missed, and it would change the case forever. 6 days after Aaron and Callum vanished, a woman staying in room 115 returned to the motel laundry room to retrieve her detergent bottle. In the process, she turned in something strange, a small white baby monitor left sitting on the folding table. At first glance, it looked like a cheap handheld unit, scuffed, slightly yellowed, a clip cracked on the back. The woman said she figured it belonged to one of the other guests, maybe the mother who'd gone missing. She'd seen her walking across the parking lot with a baby earlier that night, remembering her face from the news. When detectives picked it up, they weren't expecting much. But during an evidence sweep, a forensics tech decided to power it on. The unit was still holding a partial charge. The receiving end wasn't there, just the transmitter. And surprisingly, it had a built-in recording function. That detail had gone unnoticed until the tech noticed a blinking red LED tucked under the speaker grill. The team retrieved the data and handed it over to audio analysis. There was no video, just static, white noise, faint mechanical hums that sounded like electrical interference. The first 2 minutes were useless. But then, buried under the hiss, came a soft voice. A woman's voice, hoarse, close to the mic, as if she were speaking to someone just behind the wall. The words were hard to make out at first, but with enhancement, they became clear. "We're fine," she said. "It's okay. We're fine." Then a pause. Then silence. There was no shouting, no struggle, no second voice, just Aaron, alone, reassuring, someone, something. A knock had been audible just a second before she spoke, barely a tap, too soft to identify a rhythm, not forceful, more like a polite knock on a bedroom door. Then the voice. Then nothing. The clip ended. It lasted just under 9 seconds. Investigators reviewed the timeline again. Aaron had checked in at 9:07 p.m. The knock on the monitor, if it was real time, likely happened shortly after that. The file's embedded metadata was corrupted, likely due to low battery or cheap storage hardware, so it couldn't be time-stamped. But for a case with no evidence, no clues, no motion in or out of that room, it was a fragment of a new direction, not enough to explain what happened, but enough to confirm someone, or something, knocked on that door. What haunted detectives most was her tone. It wasn't frightening. I didn't panic. It was steady, measured, as if she were buying time, as if she knew what was about to happen next and knew there was no stopping it. They replayed it over and over, waiting for some noise, some voice, some hint of another presence. But there was nothing. Just Aaron's last audible words on Earth. And with that, the case took a darker turn. Because it was now clear, Aaron had never left that room willingly. With Aaron and Callum's disappearance stalled by silence, detectives began shifting focus away from the people in her life and toward the place itself. The motel, a low-slung roadside property built in the 1970s, was a tired structure that had changed owners half a dozen times. Its carpets were thin, its walls patched with layers of paint, its clientele mostly transient workers and truckers stopping for a night on the interstate. On the surface, it was ordinary, forgettable. But as investigators dug into its history, small cracks began to show. Public records revealed that over the last decade, 3 women had filed official complaints tied to the motel. None of them resulted in charges, none even made the news. But the similarities were difficult to ignore. Each complaint had been lodged from the same wing of the building, the back corner where Aaron's room, 112, was located. The first incident dated back to 2003. A woman traveling from Denver reported hearing whispering in her room at night. She told police she had woken at 2 a.m. to what she swore was the sound of voices right beside her bed, though when she turned on the light, the room was empty. She said items from her nightstand had been moved, her glasses case shifted, her wallet half hanging off the edge. Officers responded, but the report was chalked up to exhaustion and dismissed. The second occurred in 2005. Another woman, staying alone during a business trip, called the front desk to say she heard deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway outside her room. Slow, heavy, lasting for nearly an hour. When she finally opened the door, the corridor was empty. Security footage showed no one. She checked out the next morning and later filed a complaint with police. Again, no evidence, no charges, and the case went nowhere. The third was perhaps the most disturbing. In 2006, a young mother staying with her toddler filed a formal statement after waking to the sound of her doorknob rattling violently in the middle of the night. She claimed she heard someone pushing against the door, trying to force it open. She screamed, and the sound stopped. When she called the front desk, no staff member admitted to being near her room. The police were notified, but found nothing. The woman left in the morning without asking for a refund. Her case file ended with a single line. No suspects, no evidence. Individually, these incidents had been forgotten. But now, revisited in the light of Aaron's disappearance, they created an unsettling pattern. Each involved women traveling alone or with children, each took place in the same cluster of rooms, and each carried the same signature: disturbances in the night, signs of intrusion, no follow-up. Detectives began to wonder if what happened to Aaron wasn't a one-off tragedy, but the culmination of something that had been festering in that motel for years. They tracked down the women who had filed the earlier reports. 2 agreed to be re-interviewed. Both still sounded shaken years later. One of them admitted she never stayed in roadside motels again. The other said she couldn't explain why the footsteps had terrified her so much, but insisted, even after all this time, that she had not imagined them. The motel's management had always treated these complaints as nuisances, never threats. They rarely documented them. Employees rotated frequently, leaving little continuity. By the time Aaron checked into room 112 in 2008, no one working that night remembered or cared about the complaints from years earlier. For investigators, though, it raised a chilling question. Was Aaron the first woman to truly vanish, or just the first whose disappearance couldn't be brushed away? The possibility that the motel itself was central to the mystery gave the case a new edge. Detectives requested a deeper look into past guest records, hoping to find other reports of disturbances that might have been missed. But the records were incomplete, many handwritten ledgers long since discarded. What they did find was troubling. In the 5 years before Aaron disappeared, a disproportionate number of single-night stays had been logged in the back wing, often by women traveling alone. Many of them checked in under cash payments, leaving no trace. Still, none of those guests had vanished. None had left behind a locked room and a car in the parking lot. The motel had become less a backdrop and more a suspect. Investigators couldn't prove anything, but they couldn't ignore the echoes of past incidents either. And then, just when the case threatened to slip back into silence, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. Handwritten, anonymous. It contained only a single location, a barn 30 miles west of town, and an implication that Erin and her baby had been there. For the first time in months, detectives had somewhere new to search. 17 months had passed since Erin and Callum vanished from the motel. The case had cooled to the point of silence. Detectives rotated to other assignments, the family's appeals no longer made the front page, and the motel itself slipped back into its usual business of truckers and travelers. It was beginning to feel like another unsolved story left to gather dust. But in January of 2010, a single envelope arrived at the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office that forced the case open again. The letter was handwritten on plain-lined paper, the kind torn from a cheap notepad. There was no return address, no fingerprints that investigators could lift. The handwriting leaned left, blocky and uneven, written in all capitals. The message itself was short, only a few lines. Check the old red barn on Country Road 16, west of Crestfield. She was there. The baby, too. Nothing more. No explanation, no threat, no name. Detectives treated it cautiously. Anonymous letters had come before, most from people looking for attention, some from pranksters. But this one was different. The details were precise. County Road 16 was not a major route, not the kind of location someone would pick at random. The barn it described was a known property, long abandoned after a fire gutted the farmhouse beside it in the late 1990s. No one lived there. No one had for years. A search team was assembled within 24 hours. They drove out 30 miles west of town, past frozen fields and windbreaks of leafless trees, until the shape of the barn appeared in the distance. Faded red paint clung in strips to the wooden siding. One wall sagged where the foundation had rotted. Snowdrifts piled against the entrance. It was quiet, lifeless, the kind of place most people would drive past without giving a second glance. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the smell of old ash and animal waste. Sunlight cut through holes in the roof, catching on dust and broken rafters. At first, nothing looked unusual, just emptiness, the skeletal remains of a structure left to decay. But as investigators fanned out, one deputy noticed a patch of disturbed ground near the back wall. The soil was loose, darker than the frozen dirt around it, as if it had been turned over more recently. They began to dig. Within minutes, the shovel hit cloth. What they uncovered was a small pile of burned debris, layers of fabric fused together, charred and brittle. It took careful hands to separate them, but slowly outlines emerged, the remains of women's clothing. A sweater, a blouse, a pair of jeans with the zipper half melted. The garments were singed beyond recognition, with no labels, no intact seams. Some appeared cut, others twisted into knots. The items were bagged and sent for testing, but the most striking find wasn't in the pile itself. A few feet away, half buried under loose dirt and straw, something small and wooden caught the light, an object carved by hand. It was a baby rattle, crude, splintered, with no paint or finish. Along the handle, scratched unevenly with a knife or nail, was a single word, Callum. The discovery stopped everyone in their tracks. Up to this point, there had been no physical evidence connecting Erin and her son to any location beyond the motel. The rattle was the first tangible sign that Callum had been somewhere else, the first object that bore his name. The team stood in silence as it was lifted from the ground, bagged and sealed. One detective later admitted he felt the weight of the entire case shift in that moment. For the first time, there was proof. They had been here. The news rattled the community as much as the toy itself. Media outlets reported that the search had uncovered women's belongings in a baby's possession, fueling speculation that Erin had been taken to the barn after leaving the motel. Erin's family, who had fought to keep the case in the public eye, clung to the rattle as both a comfort and a horror. Comfort because it confirmed their daughter and grandson had been real, traceable, not ghosts. Horror because it suggested they had been hidden in a place no one would ever have looked on their own. Forensic testing began immediately. The clothing fragments were sent to state labs for DNA, but the fire damage had destroyed most biological material. No blood, no hair, no fibers strong enough to produce a match. The rattle was analyzed too, but apart from the carved name, it gave up nothing. No fingerprints, no skin oils preserved in the grain. Just the crude workmanship of someone who had time and intent. The letter that led them there was examined for trace evidence, but whoever wrote it had been careful. The paper was common, the ink generic, the blocky capitals impossible to trace to an individual. Investigators debated whether it came from the perpetrator, an accomplice, or a witness who had stayed silent for nearly a year and a half. They didn't know which possibility was worse. What the barn did give detectives was momentum. They could no longer dismiss Erin's disappearance as a voluntary vanishing or an isolated event. Someone had moved her, someone had kept her, and someone, for reasons still unclear, wanted them to know where. But even with new evidence, the case remained stubborn. No bodies, no clear suspect, just ashes, burned cloth, and a wooden rattle carved with a child's name. And as quickly as the trail appeared, it went cold again. The barn held its secrets tight, offering only fragments of a story that had already grown too dark. What investigators didn't realize then was that the barn wasn't the final hiding place. It was just a waypoint. And the truth was buried even closer than anyone imagined, right under the motel itself. By the spring of 2010, momentum had slipped away again. The anonymous letter had led detectives to the barn. The rattle had given them their first proof that Erin and Callum had lived beyond the motel. But without bodies, without DNA, without a suspect who could be tied to the scene, the investigation began to thin. Tips slowed to a trickle. Reporters moved on to fresher headlines, and the silence crept back in, heavier than before. The case was never declared closed, but for all practical purposes, it was frozen. Files were boxed and archived. Detectives rotated to new assignments, their caseloads filled with robberies, narcotics, and more recent homicides. What remained was a family waiting for answers, and a town left uneasy by the image of a motel room that had simply erased a mother and her child. For Erin's mother, Margaret, there was no such thing as moving on. She refused to change her phone number, terrified that if she did, it might be the one her daughter tried to call. She left the porch light on at night, even in the dead of winter. She bought Callum's birthday cakes every year and kept them in the freezer, stacked one on top of another, an annual ritual she admitted felt both comforting and unbearable. Her living room became a kind of shrine. The missing posters that once hung on telephone poles now hung on her walls. Copies of news clippings, photographs, even the original flyer with Erin's smiling face and Callum's wide eyes stared out from frames beside the couch. To visitors, it felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for someone who never arrived. Within the department, only one person refused to let the case slip into storage. Detective Donna Krieger, who had been assigned early on, made a quiet habit of reopening the file every few months. She never asked for extra funding, never called press conferences. She simply reread the reports, revisited the photographs, and listened to the 9-second clip from the baby monitor that ended with Erin's voice saying, "We're fine." Each time, she hoped something new would strike her. Each time, the silence pressed heavier. Krieger carried the file with her for years. Even when it wasn't officially on her desk, it remained in her mind. She drove by the motel more times than she could count. She made phone calls on anniversaries of the disappearance, checking in with labs, reconfirming evidence hadn't degraded further. When she transferred divisions, she requested to keep the file open under her name, unofficially, just in case. Rumors kept the family alive with false hope. In 2012, a truck driver claimed he saw a woman who looked like Erin at a gas station outside Topeka, Kansas. The woman was thin, carrying a toddler, and seemed nervous, he said. By the time investigators arrived, she was gone. In 2014, an anonymous tip alleged that a child enrolled under a false name at an elementary school in Iowa matched Callum's age and description. Records were checked, parents interviewed, nothing matched. Every few years, another sighting surfaced. A woman in Oklahoma who swore she saw Erin at a rest stop. A convenience store clerk in Missouri who thought he recognized Callum's face from a flyer. None of the tips held up. Each one brought a wave of hope, then a sharper wave of despair when it collapsed. Erin's sister described the cycle as being ripped open, stitched shut, and ripped open again over and over. Meanwhile, the motel itself continued operating. Travelers came and went, most of them unaware of the story buried in its history. The owners changed again in 2015, repainting the walls and recarpeting the hallways, but they could not scrub away the reputation. Locals whispered about room 112. Employees asked not to be assigned to clean it. Guests occasionally requested to be moved when they learned of its past. The motel had become a shadowed landmark, not for what it offered, but for what it had taken. The case grew older. 17 months turned into 5 years, then nearly a decade. Detectives retired, witnesses moved, paper records yellowed with age. Still, Margaret kept the same phone line, the same message on the answering machine. She told herself that one day Aaron's voice might be on the other end, faint, fragile, reaching back after all this time. But by the time 2017 came and went, even the public stopped asking. Missing persons posters were long gone from the telephone poles. News stations no longer marked the anniversary. For most people, the disappearance of Aaron and Callum became a ghost story. For Donna Krieger, it was never a ghost story. It was unfinished business. She kept believing that somewhere in the evidence, some overlooked detail would explain how a mother and child could vanish into a locked room, leave only a single rattle in a burned barn, and disappear again. She would be proven right. But the answer would not come quickly. It would not come gently. It would arrive in violence, in a storm that ripped open the ground itself. And when it did, the silence that had swallowed the case for nearly 2 decades would finally give way to something far darker than anyone expected. By 2025, the motel where Aaron and her son had last been seen was no longer in operation. Years of declining business, lawsuits, and a lingering reputation had left it boarded up, its windows covered, the parking lot cracked with weeds pushing through the asphalt. Locals still drove past it on the interstate, but few ever slowed down. It was a building that carried too much history, too much weight. For nearly 2 decades it stood silent, a hollow reminder of a case no one could close. That silence broke one summer night when a storm rolled across Lancaster County. It was violent, dumping inches of rain in a matter of hours, flooding fields and forcing creeks to spill over their banks. Wind tore down power lines, roads washed out, and behind the old motel where runoff collected, the ground gave way. By morning, a wide sinkhole had opened, swallowing part of the backlot and leaving a jagged scar in the earth. A county work crew was sent out to secure the area. As they pumped water from the hole and began clearing debris, something unexpected came into view. Beneath layers of mud and shattered concrete sat a square sheet of metal, weathered but intact, wedged into the ground like a hidden door. At first, they thought it was an old septic tank cover or maintenance hatch left behind during construction. But when they cleared the edges, they realized it was larger, heavier, and sealed tight. Law enforcement was called in. Within hours, detectives and crime scene technicians were standing over the find. The motel had been searched countless times over the years, but no records, no blueprints had ever mentioned a substructure, no maintenance logs, no schematics filed with the county. The metal hatch appeared to have been intentionally concealed. With permission, the team cut through the rusted hinges and forced it open. What they found beneath would reawaken a case long thought buried. The hatch opened onto a narrow shaft leading down into darkness. The air that rose up was stale, suffocating, with a faint stench of rot. At the bottom sat a 6-by-6-foot concrete chamber. Its walls were unfinished, its ceiling low, the kind of space no guest would have ever known existed. But inside, scattered across the floor, were remnants that left the team silent. Rotting pieces of bedding clung to one corner, a stained mattress pad, tattered blankets hardened with age. Near it, small objects lay coated in dirt, a pacifier, a baby's sock, fragments of children's clothing, all shriveled and brittle from years of decay. Against one wall, metal hardware jutted from the concrete, shackles drilled directly into the stone, their chains rusted but still intact. The room wasn't in storage. It wasn't a forgotten maintenance space. It was a holding cell. Every investigator who stepped inside knew immediately what they were looking at. This wasn't just another lead. This was the missing piece that had eluded them for 17 years. Aaron and Callum had not walked away from the motel, had not vanished into the night, had not been spirited off to another state. They had been here, beneath the very building where they were last seen, sealed inside a space no one had ever thought to check. Forensics photographed and cataloged everything. Every scrap of fabric, every trace of plastic, every chain link was bagged and removed. The pacifiers were found in pairs, as though someone had stocked the room with them deliberately. A cracked baby bottle lay in the corner, its rubber nipple hardened into a misshapen lump. On the wall, faint scratches marred the concrete, shallow but deliberate. Lines, gouges, and what some believed were initials, though age and erosion had made them nearly illegible. Detectives who had worked the original case returned to the scene, some of them retired, drawn back by a discovery they had stopped believing would ever come. For them, the chamber represented both vindication and horror. Vindication that Aaron and her son had been held against their will, confirming what her family had always insisted. Horror, because it revealed how close the answers had always been, hidden just beneath their feet. News of the chamber spread quickly. The community that had lived with the mystery for nearly 2 decades was suddenly thrust back into it, confronted with images of rusted chains and tiny baby clothes recovered from underground. Aaron's mother, now older and frailer, was told of the discovery in private before the press announcement. She wept as investigators described what they had found, clinging to the confirmation that her daughter and grandson had not simply walked away. They had been victims. Still, questions loomed. Who built the chamber? When was it constructed? And how had it managed to remain hidden through multiple ownerships, inspections, and years of searching? The answers would not come immediately. But for investigators, the storm had done what years of searching could not. It had torn open the ground and revealed the truth. The chamber was not just a crime scene. It was a message. Someone had designed it, used it, and sealed it. And buried within it were clues that would lead them back, not to strangers, but to someone they had overlooked all along. Because the motel hadn't simply been the backdrop to Aaron and Callum's disappearance. It had been a trap. And the man who owned it at the time had left behind secrets darker than anyone suspected. When investigators first stepped into the concrete chamber, they collected every scrap of fabric, every fragment of rusted chain, every plastic pacifier. Forensic testing began immediately. Soil samples, pollen, and fabric composition were all examined. The results came back with a grim confirmation. The bedding and clothing fragments were consistent with products manufactured and sold in 2007 and 2008. The chamber hadn't been some relic from decades past. It was active at the exact time Aaron and Callum disappeared. The discovery deepened the mystery of its construction. County blueprints for the motel showed no substructure beneath room 112. No maintenance shaft, no plans for a storm shelter or storage cellar. The concrete walls were poured by hand. The hatch fabricated privately, not commercially. Someone had built it deliberately, outside of official channels, and had taken measures to hide it. That narrowed the pool of suspects dramatically. Attention turned back to the man who owned the motel in 2008, when Aaron checked in. His name was Raymond Lutz. He had died in 2016 at the age of 62, from what the obituary described as a brief illness. His neighbors remembered him as quiet, reserved, the kind of man who waved politely but kept to himself. He had never married, had no children, and ran the motel with a minimalist staff. When things broke, plumbing, locks, electrical wiring, he fixed them himself. Guests sometimes complained that he was overly present, hovering near the rooms, checking on them uninvited. But nothing had ever risen to the level of police involvement. Digging deeper into his background, investigators discovered something troubling. Raymond Lutz wasn't his original name. In the 1990s, he had lived in Iowa under the name Richard Kelso. Under that identity, he had been briefly investigated in connection with the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl from a small town outside Des Moines. The girl, a motel housekeeper, vanished after a night shift. Witnesses placed Kelso near the property that evening, but there had been no physical evidence to tie him to the crime. The case went unsolved. Within a year, Kelso left Iowa, legally changed his name, and resurfaced in Nebraska as Lutz. For years, the Iowa case gathered dust, unsolved, just like Aaron's would. But with the discovery of the chamber, the parallels were impossible to ignore. A motel. A young woman vanished, an owner with both the opportunity and the privacy to hide evidence. The theory began to take shape. Lutz had constructed the chamber beneath his own business, a hidden room only he could access, where he could hold someone without anyone ever knowing. Former employees of the motel were interviewed again. One recalled that Lutz spent long nights in the maintenance corridors, telling staff he was repairing plumbing or checking water lines. Another remembered that he poured new concrete in the rear lot around 2007, claiming he was repairing drainage problems. At the time, no one thought much of it, but looking back, those details aligned disturbingly well with the construction of a hidden room. The chamber itself bore his signature. Investigators noted that the welds on the metal hatch matched repairs found on old motel fixtures Lutz had done himself. The way the concrete had been poured, uneven with amateur lines, indicated it wasn't professional work. It was a secret project by someone who had the tools, the privacy, and the determination to complete it alone. Even his personality began to fit. On the surface, Lutz had been ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of man no one paid attention to. But beneath that exterior lay a pattern: name changes, relocations, unexplained late-night projects, and a proximity to women who disappeared. Aaron and Callum's case, which had confounded investigators for years, now pointed directly to him. What made the revelation more chilling was the timing of his death. Lutz had passed away in 2016, 7 years before the chamber was unearthed. Whatever he had done, he had taken to the grave, never charged, never confronted, never forced to answer for it. For Aaron's family, that fact cut deepest. There would be no trial, no confession, no opportunity to face the man who had stolen their daughter and grandson. Only shadows left behind in concrete walls. Detectives began reconstructing the possible timeline. Aaron checked into room 112 in August of 2008. Sometime after, Lutz likely used a hidden access point to enter the chamber. He brought her and Callum down, locking them inside. The baby items, the bedding, the shackles, all confirmed it wasn't a temporary hiding place. It was meant for keeping them alive, at least for a time. When the storm revealed the chamber 17 years later, their possessions were still there, preserved by the sealed environment. It explained what investigators had struggled with for years: how Aaron could vanish from a locked room with no sign of exit. She never left the motel. She was taken below it. The focus now shifted to proving it beyond doubt. DNA testing began on the remnants from the chamber. Fragments of bone, minuscule but present, were sent to labs for comparison. What came back would bring the final confirmation everyone had been waiting for. Because hidden inside a rusted box from Lutz's past, investigators were about to find the piece of evidence that didn't just point toward him. It told the entire story of what he had done. After the chamber was unearthed, investigators knew they were close. But they still lacked a confession. Lutz was dead, and with him, whatever explanations he might have given. But a cold case team working through his financial records found one overlooked lead. In 2015, a year before his death, Lutz had rented a storage unit on the edge of town. It had been abandoned after his passing and left unpaid, the contents sealed away. When investigators obtained a warrant and opened the unit, they discovered a series of rusted metal boxes stacked against the back wall. Inside one of them was the truth that had been missing for 17 years. The box contained scattered receipts, motel keys, and several Polaroid photographs. The images were faded, grainy, but unmistakable. They showed the concrete chamber, the bedding, a baby's bottle placed on the floor. In one photograph, there was a stroller positioned in the corner, the same model Aaron had carried with her into the motel the night she disappeared. The pictures offered no faces, no living bodies, but the implication was undeniable. He had documented his hidden space. Beneath the photos lay a stack of notebooks bound with electrical tape. Only one remained intact enough to be legible. It was a journal, written in a neat but obsessive hand, covering years of entries. As detectives flipped through the pages, a picture began to form, not of a business owner, not of a recluse, but of a man who had built an entire private world beneath his motel. The journal spoke of a quiet family he kept hidden, a mother and child he referred to only as hers and the boy. He wrote about the chamber as if it were a home, describing how he furnished it, how he rationed food, how he silenced noise when guests walked above. He described Aaron as the unwilling wife, Callum as the perfect child. The entries grew darker as they went on, shifting from detached observations to fantasies of permanence, as though he believed he could keep them there forever. The most chilling part was how ordinary his language became. There was no recognition of crime, no acknowledgement of captivity. Instead, he described meals, sleep, and the sound of Callum's crying as though it were part of daily life. In his words, the chamber wasn't a prison. It was a household. But near the end, the tone shifted again. The entries became erratic, frantic. He wrote of the difficulty in hiding food purchases, of the risk of being discovered, of the pressure mounting with each passing week. The final entry was the shortest of all, written in shaky handwriting across the bottom of a yellowing page. "I couldn't feed them anymore." That line became the case's turning point, coupled with the Polaroids. It was the closest thing to a confession investigators would ever receive. DNA testing provided the final confirmation. Among the debris recovered from the chamber, forensic analysts had found small bone fragments near the bedding. At the time, they had been too degraded to test. But with advances in genetic sequencing, they were re-examined and successfully matched to Aaron and Callum. After years of doubt and speculation, their identities were confirmed. The chamber was not just where they had been held, it was where their lives had ended. For Aaron's family, the news was both relief and devastation. Relief, because after nearly 2 decades, there was an answer. Proof that she had not chosen to walk away. Proof that her son had not simply disappeared into the ether. Devastation, because the truth revealed how close they had been the entire time. Aaron and Callum had been trapped beneath the very building detectives searched again and again. Every time investigators walked those hallways, every time family members stood outside room 112 begging for answers, the two of them had been below, hidden behind concrete and steel. Veteran detectives admitted the discovery shook them more than any other case in their careers. The details in Lutz's journal, the routines, the ordinary tone, the lack of remorse, painted a picture of a man who had blended into the background of his community while keeping his victims only feet from the lives they once lived. Even hardened officers struggled to read his words without stepping away. In 2025, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office declared the case officially closed. The disappearance of Aaron Callahan and her son, Callum, had been solved, but the closure came with no trial, no sentencing, no justice in the traditional sense. The man responsible had died years earlier, his secret buried with him until nature itself tore it open. The motel was demolished soon after, its walls leveled, its foundations crushed. Locals gathered to watch the building fall, some cheering, others silent, as if trying to erase the weight of what had happened there. But even as the ground was cleared, the memory of the chamber remained. 17 years after Aaron carried her son through the motel's front doors, the truth had been found. A journal, a rattle, fragments of clothing, and words scribbled in the final line of a notebook revealed the horror of how close she and Callum had been all along. Not hundreds of miles away, not hidden by strangers, but beneath the very place where they were last seen. For investigators, the case was closed, but for those who had lived with the mystery, the revelation left an even heavier question lingering. How many other secrets had Raymond Lutz buried in silence, and how many others had never been found at all?